Welcome back. I hope you saw in your homework this week the impact of God as creator, and not just a creator, but the creator. The number of times that the word God is repeated in Genesis, and then the number of times that it's followed by an action word, it shows us that the intention of this first chapter in the Bible is to put God front and center as the agent of creation, the one who created everything out of nothing. We also saw this repeated use of categorizing words or phrases. God is a God of order, not a God of chaos. And so he created things according to their kind or to their kinds with purpose. He designed his creation for specific purposes and places. This isn't random chance. And the opposite of random chance is divine providence. And the word providence, it comes from a Latin word that describes foreseeing or attending to or care. So divine providence is the protective care and tending of a God who knows all and sees all. And God's divine providence, it covers all of his creation. We read in Isaiah 34:16 that God has written in his book that every bird will find its mate, not one will be missing. Jesus himself, he said, not one sparrow falls to the ground without him knowing about it. God sees, God knows. His protective care, it extends to everything he's created, but humanity, it lives under the special blessing and purpose of God. They have been created as the apex of his creation. They're stamped with the very image of God. And God gave Adam and Eve the task of being his vice regents. They were to rule under God and then over all that God had created. They were supposed to be fruitful and multiply and fill up God's creation with more and more of his image and his glory. In God's providential care, he made them. He placed them in the garden. He made sure that they were surrounded with beauty and nourishment. They had everything they needed, and they had purposeful and meaningful work in this garden as well. And even better, we haven't gotten around to reading this part of Genesis yet, but we're going to see when we get to chapter 3 that even better, where God has placed them, God is with them. And Genesis 2, it closes with this beautiful verse that says that man and woman were both naked and they were not ashamed. Adam and Eve, they were completely exposed before each other and before their creator, and they felt no shame. Can you imagine a state like that? And I mean, I'm not just talking about physical nakedness. Can you imagine if everything about you was on display for God and all of humanity to see, and not feeling a stitch of angst about any of that, not feeling the tiniest temptation to cover up even one tiny detail? This is a picture of profound intimacy between created beings, but also between created beings and their creator. It's the innocence of Eden. God's people were in God's place, living under his rule and under his blessing. And it would seem that there was nothing else that they could ever need or want, except there was just this one thing. And we haven't seen what it is yet in the Genesis account, but in some of the readings we did this week, we could see that problems had crept into the created order. It no longer exists in a place or a state of shameless innocence. But we didn't need to read any specific Bible passages to come to this knowledge. We know it, we live it, we feel it inside of us. A couple of years back, I was enjoying some time to myself. I was reading a novel, having a bubble bath, and suddenly my quiet time was interrupted with this ethereal music that came out of nowhere. It started quietly, but it was quickly growing louder, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is the heavenly orchestra that is announcing Jesus's return. And my heart started to race. I grabbed my towel, I jumped out of the tub, I was looking for something to throw on, and I'm praying with these loud and earnest words because while I do long for the return of Jesus, I was like, if I am going to be meeting Jesus in the air, I just want some clothes on. So I was scrambling, trying to find something to throw on before some sense returned to me, and I was like, hey, This isn't happening in the twinkling of an eye, so it probably isn't Jesus's return. And turns out what had happened was my towel had just fallen on top of my phone and activated a playlist. But in that moment of feeling very exposed, my first instinct was to cover up. And that feeling went beyond the physical. I didn't just desire to cover up parts of my body, I wanted to cover up thoughts and motives and intentions and actions. Why? Because I'm not innocent. There is a gap between the ending of Genesis chapter 2 and what we experience today. And it comes as a result of the one thing that created beings wanted but didn't have, and that's autonomy. And autonomy comes from the Greek word autos, which is for self, and the other Greek word nomos, which is for law. Autonomy is self-law, the right or the ability to govern ourselves, freedom from external control or influence, independence. And Merriam-Webster says, especially moral independence. Adam and Eve, they wanted the one thing that they didn't have, and that was the freedom to make the rules. And we know that they didn't have the freedom to make the rules because we read in Genesis 2:16 that God gave man a command. There was one tree in the garden that they did not have permission to eat from. That's it. That was the one restriction that was placed on humanity. And Adam's job was to share this command with Eve and then to tend and to protect not just the garden, but the rule of the king of the garden. And if I was a betting woman, I would bet that if God told Adam, you know what, you can't eat from that tree for 6 days of the week, but on the 7th you can eat of it. Or if he said, you can eat of it all 6 days of the week, just not on the 7th, I bet they would still have been tempted to eat from it. And that's not a perfect, maybe even a very good analogy, because it assumes that the rule was arbitrary and just put there as a test to see if they would obey. And that isn't the case. God's rules, they're never arbitrary. They're always an overflow of who he is and what he knows and what will be for our good. But the reason I use the analogy anyway is to make the point that the problem for Adam and Eve wasn't so much that specific rule. It was the fact that God had made a rule that they were to submit to. It was the fact that there was a rule and they didn't get to make it. Unless we think, they are terrible people and we wish we could have had a crack at being in the garden and obeying just that one rule. Don't get your hopes up, because none of us would have fared any better. The problem with people, with created beings, is that they want what they can't have. They want to be God. They want to make the rules. To believe the doctrine of creation as it's communicated in the Bible is to accept something that is admittedly hard and something that is going to be a reason for struggle as long as we are still living in our bodies of flesh. And that's, if God is the creator of everything, it means that he has authority over everything. He is why we're here, so he gets to say why we're here. He gets to say how we should live while we're here. He made it. He gets to say how it should be used. And we reflect this knowledge intuitively in our culture through copyright and patent laws, because they exist on the premise that what we create, we own. These are laws that give creators power and authority over what they create. And God, as creator, gives him authority over his creation. Seeing God as the creator, understanding the doctrine of creation, is to acknowledge that God's creation answers to him. He does not answer to them. If you've ever dealt with toddlers who have the ability to communicate but not the ability to rationalize on a deep or a complex level, you have probably seen this desire for autonomy play out. Parents were told, keep your toddlers happy by offering them choice. Why? Because it gives them a sense of autonomy, right? It gives them a perception of being in control. And so you offer them a choice that's within an acceptable range for you. So instead of saying to your toddler, what color cup do you want? You hold up an orange cup and a green cup and you say, which cup would you like? And they will say they want the yellow. And this behavior, it's not limited to toddlers. I'm telling you, every time I see a wet paint sign, my first instinct and desire is I want to touch that just to see, is it really wet? You know, why can't I touch it? When I was in kindergarten, I think it was like the first really cold day of the year. That's how I remember it. But before we left to go outside for recess, as we're heading out the door, my teacher says, now remember kids, don't lick the metal bars on the playground. And I thought, what an odd thing to say, because who would want to lick a metal bar that hundreds of kids have touched? But you know what I thought about for that entire recess? Why did she say that? What would happen if I were to lick one of those metal bars? Will we suddenly discover, if we do it, that licking metal is actually a wonderful thing that the teachers have been keeping from us? Is that what they do when we all leave and go home at the end of the day? Do they keep all that pleasure for themselves? Is that what they're about? And I couldn't get these thoughts out of my head. And so when the bell rang and everyone else was running towards the school doors at the end of recess, I quickly snuck in a lick. And to my shock and dismay and pain, I discovered that my tongue was stuck to that metal bar and I couldn't get it loose. So I stood there, tongue stuck, crying. And my teacher was a wonderful lady named Miss Susie, and seeing my self-inflicted pain, she comforted me. And she told me that she was going to save me. And then she went and got some warm water, and she warned me the process of getting unstuck, the process of getting free, it was going to hurt. But she said I would have to feel the pain if I didn't want to be stuck to that bar forever. And then she gently and she lovingly freed me. And I felt so ashamed. Why had I ever doubted her? Why had I doubted that her rules were going to be for my good? Because had she ever proven herself to be cruel or untrustworthy to me? Ever? No, not even one time. And the problem, it wasn't with her, it was with me. The problem wasn't even with the rule, the problem was with me. And the prophet Isaiah, he warned God's people about their consequences to the blindness of who God is. And he said in chapter 29, verse 16, he said, you turn things upside down. Shall the potter be regarded as the clay, that the thing made should say of its maker, he did not make me? Or the thing formed say of him who formed it, he has no understanding? And we saw that in our Romans chapter 1 reading this week, that people are turning things upside down. We're doing it all the time. Instead of honoring God as creator, we want autonomy. We want to worship. We want to honor and reverence and adore and serve what we want. We want the freedom to be able to exchange places between creator and created. And this rebellion has bound us to some very painful consequences. And the problem is not with God. And the problem is not with his rules. It's with us. It's with our desire to rebel against our creator and against our king and to rule ourselves, to make our own rules. We get things turned around and we get things turned upside down because we think we know better. We think that rebelling isn't going to be painful and it isn't going to be dangerous. We mistakenly think that God's rules are arbitrary and that they're open to negotiation. And the doctrine of creation tells us that God as creator gives him the right and the authority to rule. And in our homework this week, we're going to see that it means it also gives him the authority to judge. He has the authority to hold his creation accountable to his standard. And these aren't easy things to consider, but if we consider them in light of the divine providence of God, who saw before the creation of the world how things would turn out, and who in love provided a way out, if we consider these things in light of the divine providence of God, who entered into his creation and lived among it so that he could gently and lovingly free us from the pain of being stuck in our sin, the one who let the pain of our rebellion and choices fall on him. If we understand these things in light of this God, we see that this is a God who we can trust to rule rightly and to judge justly. This God is a safe refuge for us.